this. All right, welcome back everybody to our next panel. This is going to be about kind of the future of esports and some of the different ways that we can activate both traditional sports and the digitization of traditional sports to become, I guess, what we would call a digital sport or a traditional sport played in a digital way. Very similar things to the VR presentation that we just saw moments ago. And then also talk about the application of esports and the future and where we kind of see that going. So I'd like to go ahead and start off by talking about a couple of, I guess, kind of points that come to the forefront as we look towards the digitization of points. Because I've started close to me and gone farther away, I'm going to mix it up by starting asking for a few other thoughts about esports as it concerns with VR. Now, we got a chance to see some digitization of traditional sports as it applied to VR, but what are some of your thoughts, Sean, about the application of esports and VR to the future?
Wow, I think it is a very general question. Actually, I was working within the esports industry till 2011. So from that time, the esports has been a lot changed. I was away from esports a bit for 7 years. So as I briefly said in a presentation, I think VR sports can be make esports to be look like more sports, traditional sports, which can embrace more sports fans to enter the esports world, which can be a bigger, opportunity for esports as well. And yes, I think it can help sports fans to enter the gaming world easily, because as you already seen in our video clips, our games are played by real sports gears. So it is a physical movement. To them, it is a sport. So they can really enjoy these sports games with their preferred style. And after that, step by step, they can enter, like maybe they can enter their play with their League of Legends or Dota 2. Something like that. So I think VR sports game can be a bridge for in between esports and sports. Maybe this can be my best answer.
It's a pretty good answer. Moving on, Jason, now talking about your work as part of the IeSF Athletes Commission. When it comes to looking forward towards the future of sports, I know that's something that we heard from our pro sports representative, Huni, a little bit earlier. That's kind of a thought on players' minds. While they may be a professional in one esport, well, that's not always going to be around. So looking towards the future of esports, cool opportunities like AR and VR, what is your thought as a representative of the Athletes Commission about the direction that esports seems to be going towards the future?
Well, I think that's quite an interesting topic for esports moving forward, because even when I started esports, I've changed games about 3 times as the scene progresses. And so when you look at the future of esports, it's very unclear, especially for athletes. So like bridging the gaps between traditional sports and esports is definitely a very helpful idea, because obviously if you play football, you'll play football for your entire life without having to adapt to a newer, later version. We even saw it at this tournament with the League of Legends. We played on a previous patch because the new patch had such big changes that none of the teams were prepared for. So definitely things like that do make life harder as an athlete. But I would say that bridging the gap to make it more officially recognized is the right way forward.
Okay, moving forward. Talking to you, Andy, what are your thoughts about moving forward with, I guess, more of what Sean's presentation was about, moving forward with the realization of the digital aspects as applied to traditional sports? We saw traditional sports being digitized and being played in a virtual reality kind of setting. What is the value that that offers to traditional sports? Why would you want to play a digital version when you could go out and do it yourself, right?
Yeah, I asked the same question myself. I think the starting point, though, for this conversation is actually to recognize that technology is a currency. And whether it's the latest iPhone or the latest VR headset, there's an excitement and energy that operates around the technology that is monetized, and it's something that's really exciting for people. I remember in Rio for the Olympic Games last year, in the Olympic Park you have a number of sponsor pavilions, and the most exciting one was Samsung And one of the reasons for that was they had an amazing VR installation, which allowed people to try out their latest VR headsets on these banks of VR simulators, so kind of really full body simulation. And people had never tried it before. And I think that aspect of it, giving people experiences they haven't tried before, is a big part of what's happening in virtual reality. And actually, even the content is much more expansive than just those traditional sports. So there's one really great VR game called Acoustic Shield, where you have an audio track being played and your job is to kind of block things, and it's a hell of a workout. So it's incredibly popular. And at the University of Salford last month, we had an expo called Game Lab, and within that, we showed a prototype of a low-friction 360 platform, which you then wear the VR headset in, and you can be Pac-Man within a virtual reality experience running around the labyrinth. And there you have, again, this interaction between gaming and physical activity. So even if you take out the kind of formal traditional sports that we see and just expand them into a whole range of other physical activity pursuits, it's, the sky is the limit, I think.
Talking about some of the limits or some of the potentials, moving on to you, Matthew, you have kind of a unique perspective as someone that works with a more traditional sport, one that is recognized by many federations around the world. And when you watch virtualization of things like your sport, how does that make you feel? What are your thoughts about the virtualization of traditional sports like table tennis specifically?
Well, it's great. Table tennis has been around since 1926. So here we are, 2017, and we're seeing you put on a headset and you're playing ping pong, basically. So for the ITTF, we for sure need to be embracing this, because our goal is to get as many people around the world playing and watching table tennis. And right now, to play table tennis, you need a table, you need a racket, and you need a ball, basically. And not everyone has a table tennis table. So if they've got a pair of goggles now with Sean's fancy new game, they're playing table tennis. And for the ITTF, they're playing table tennis. That's brilliant for us. And then hopefully this would create an appetite and create a desire to actually then go play regular table tennis. Or even if not, they're playing this new form of VR table tennis every day. That's brilliant for us. So it's fantastic for me being here, listening to all of you, listening to the panels, because this is very foreign to me. I'm a traditional sports guy that goes and puts a table in a hall, and we have fancy lights, we broadcast it on TV, OTT, or the fancy new social media and everything. But now it's a completely different dimension. We're talking about esports, and how can someone as archaic as an international federation like ITTF get involved with this? So we are opening our eyes, and we want to get more and more into this movement, because we see, as Sean's presentation said, the younger people playing e-games. They're maybe not watching the NBA or watching Major League Baseball, or probably table tennis events on TV. So for us, it's definitely something we will be exploring more, and hopefully I'll be leaving Busan with a few new business cards and a few new friends to start getting table tennis and VR and other non-traditional models of the sport.
As somebody who is quite terrible at table tennis, I look forward to the opportunity of being able to play with someone that won't judge me on the other end. So it's a cool opportunity, not only for people who may not have the means to play table tennis, no table, no racket, no friend on the other side, but it's a great opportunity to kind of make that adaptable to an entirely new audience.
Exactly, and that, at the end of the day, that's our goal, for more people participating, watching, and playing table tennis. And I'm sure you all know the first video game was table tennis, Pong, back in the 70s or 80s. So it's very cool for us to be in the forefront or pioneer of the e-gaming sphere with Pong all the way back in the day. And now we need to get back in the more modern society and work with people like Sean and many of you to be getting table tennis out there.
So moving on, talking about kind of the value that can be created from some of these synergies, applying technology to traditional sports, digitizing them, and creating what could be called an e-sport, but of a more traditional sport. Andy, you were talking about, as we got a chance to have a conversation yesterday, some of the value that can be presented through that synergy. Maybe talk about at least a little bit of what you've seen as far as either this being implemented or some of the value that can come out of that synergy.
Well, I think it's really important to look at it from both sides of the equation, from the esports industry, but also the sports. And having a proposition that makes sense for both parties or both industries is really crucial. I've noticed a real change in the last 2 years in people's perception of esports from the sporting side. But there's still this sort of question about, why would you not just pick up a bat and go and play table tennis? It might be that you don't have a table. But I think one of the things that I've also noticed in particular is how the organizations around both industries have changed as well. So the fact that we now have a Coca-Cola weekly YouTube program on esports, and the fact that Coca-Cola was one of the earliest Olympic sports, I think tells you that the ecosystem around sport is changing dramatically around this digital technology. And my take on things like the Olympic channel are that it's sort of mindful of how the entire digital ecosystem of sport is changing too. And in that respect, it's the anxiety, I think, in Olympic circles would be that if you're losing kind of generations of potential players in your sports to digital games, then there's a need and an obligation to actually occupy that space. So I would see, looking at something like the Olympic Charter, that being present within esports is an obligation. It follows out of the mission. And trying to find ways of doing that reaches new participants is one of the really exciting opportunities. And I think that it's right to think about it in those terms. So trying to expand the range of people that want to be physically active or indeed want to be gamers is perhaps the biggest opportunity, I would say.
So I guess moving forward, maybe addressing the entire panel, what is the application of this virtual reality or augmented reality technology to society? I know that many societies like to advertise either neighborhood or community efforts towards sports. Do you think that we'll see a movement by the same more social aspect to advertise VR sports or AR sports, or what is the future that the future of esports or traditional sports being virtualized? What does that offer to society, basically?
I'll have a go then.
All right, go right at it.
I've found that one of the most exciting things about it is that people are having completely different experiences, different kinds of social interactions. I remember back in 1999, in the University of Chicago, did a piece of research looking at the game Dance Dance Revolution.
Okay.
Anyone remember that game? And what they did was to look at a kind of arcade setting and study what happens within it with that game. And some of the things they discovered were it changed the social demographic of people that entered the arcade. It changed the relationship between boys and girls within that arcade. And it brought people into physical activity in ways that they hadn't before. And as much as we like to think that sports are kind of universally accessible, in actual fact, it turns off a lot of people very early on in life, and they never come back to sports. So digital, I think, can be a way of bringing people back into it. And if you think about what's happened with digital over the last 10 years, we've moved from a period of time where we're kind of sitting and consuming content through screens to an expectation to be active, to be co-producers of content, to be actively sharing things. And if you look even at the Olympic channel as an example, it's all based around sort of interactivity. And so that aspect is also recognizing that we're not the same spectators as we used to be. We expect to be part of the show as well. And I think that's what's happening also around the broadcast industry. So you see relationships between companies like Vislink and the NHL partnering with GoPro and creating this kind of synergy of performance data, which then gives rise to a bespoke televisual experience where you can choose your perspective of whichever player you want. And I think those are incredibly dynamic, incredibly exciting opportunities for people.
Also see it as breaking down the barriers to participation. Mm-hmm. So use table tennis as an example. You'll probably be quite shy to go into your local table tennis club and go, okay, I'm going to play table tennis because...
That's not going to happen.
Because you'd be petrified that you would look like an idiot. Like I personally would, playing archery or trying to run 100 meters against a professional runner.
Right.
So for me, being in my lounge room to be able to play table tennis or archery or box against Manny Pacquiao, still getting the exercise and the physical activity, which my PE teacher always kept on telling me I need to do, is brilliant because I'm player XYZ. And if I'm terrible at it, then people can't judge me or criticize me because they're never going to see who I am. So that gives kids and even adults a lot more potential and the confidence to be doing physical activity. And plus, if you feel like playing table tennis or working out at 2 a.m. and your local club or the gym or the local running track is closed, you can still get out your VR headset or whatever game you want to play and get a workout and be meeting new people as well, a social experience, and playing table tennis against a bloke in China or Australia or Zimbabwe, that you wouldn't get that experience. And you are exercising your mind, you're exercising your reflexes, and you're burning energy, and you're getting the workout that you need and your body desires. So just breaking down barriers.
Jason?
I think just to add to that, traditional sport has got a lot of restrictions on many different people. And what VR can do is let some semi-disabled people be able to partake in sports that they wouldn't normally be able to do. I saw a demonstration at one event of just a simple roller coaster virtual reality. And someone who normally can't go to a amusement park to partake in this kind of activity can still experience the feeling that everyone has when they go on a roller coaster. So I think virtual reality is very good in that sense, that it really can allow everyone to partake along with the other stuff that has been said.
So, Sean, you were talking earlier, kind of introducing us to what you've been working on, digitizing traditional sports into a more virtual medium. What is it that you look for when you consider translating a physical sport that people are either familiar with or would play physically into a digital experience? How do you go about translating that? Is it a one-to-one, or is there any extra consideration that you look for?
Can you speak it in other ways? Maybe?
Oh, just saying, what is the process like when you go to translating a physical sport into a digital VR experience?
Actually, VR means virtual reality.
Mm-hmm.
We believe that actualize it, most reality thing will be very important. So that's why we are working with Manny Pacquiao. So we observe his boxing skills to our games to make our game as much as close to reality. And in terms of the table tennis we built, we are also working with the amateur table tennis players in Korea. So I hope from now on I'd like to work with Matt for that to upgrade our games. And so translated from the real players to the actual digital world, so that all the players think it is almost similar to real. So in that sense, we want to make it as a game as well as a sport itself.
I mean, just to come in on that a little bit, it's worth understanding a bit about the technology ecosystem around something like VR. There's a company, for example, called Virtually Live, and what they're doing is taking a kind of Formula One racing experience, a live event, and mapping it into a computer-generated moving image so that you could put on your VR headset and see the race as it's taking place and occupy any particular part of that route. And I think the translation of the kind of physical world from a televisual filmic content into a computer-generated image is a really good example of that added value that comes out of that collaboration, because once broadcast quality is indistinguishable from the quality of computer-generated vector images, then you have this complete clash of cultures and creativity that's happening, but also it puts you into a live experience still. And many of the things we talk about in VR at the moment are game-like experiences, secondary assets compared to the live elite competition. But what we're seeing now already is the translation of a real-time elite event into a VR experience, and that's incredibly exciting, I think.
I know you were mentioning additional broadcast or the integration of VR into things like the NHL with the tracking of athletes, either eye movements or just sort of seeing what they see as a way of increasing the way that sports teams are able to analyze player performance. You were also talking, at least to me yesterday, about the ways that this is being added into traditional broadcasting. And so maybe speak a little bit about what it looks like, the future of traditional sports from a broadcast standpoint now that VR is becoming more popular.
Well, it's worth noting that Rio last year was the first time that the IOC began experimenting with 360 filmmaking and putting that into content that could be consumed in different territories. So even something like 360 experiences I mean, it's just remarkable what still could be done. I remember conversations a few years ago about photography in sports, and my work's always in the Olympics, so that's my context. But there's a sense of, well, how do you innovate with photography at the Olympic Games when everything's the same every time? You know, it's the same sport, same positions, and there's been a really kind of creative outburst within that field with things like in London, they had pool cams. So within the swimming pool, there was a camera set up underwater, and each camera had its own Twitter account and was tweeting images from the activity as it was taking place. And within a couple of days of setting up those accounts, there were 30,000 followers to that automated pool camera. So the innovation around the technology is remarkable, but I think in particular, this sense of trying to transform and create bespoke experiences, because the direction of travel for any kind of media content consumption, whether it's Instagram or NBC, is that people want to have a kind of unique experience that's tailored to their own interests. And providing those opportunities is only possible through digital content, but it's especially easier when you translate televisual content into computer-generated images. And that's where I think these two worlds come together.
Absolutely. So as we look towards the future of digitalization of traditional sports, or of esports pursuing more virtual reality, what does that future look like for the esports athlete? Is it one where the traditional sports athlete fades into obsolescence, or is it one where they grow closer together now that they both have this virtual aspect to their disciplines?
Well, I think when virtual reality becomes so close to the real thing, that athletes will need to be both well equipped in the esports side and the physical side, I think it'll bring a whole new sport onto the table. So in my personal opinion, I think there'll always be the traditional sports and there'll always be the esports. And then when a game, I'm going to use Counter-Strike because that's the game I play, but if that went into the virtual reality with, as you were mentioning earlier, the treadmill where you can go 360, I think you'll have a whole new brand of athlete who is both into the game in esports, but also physically fit and able to be able to play the game as if it's real life.
I mean, I think I would take that a bit further. I would say that the future of all sports is esports. And what I mean by that is it's a diversification of what esports entails. But in fact, if you look at most traditional sports now, they're trying to find ways of gamifying the experience even further through the sorts of principles that underpin computer games. And so trying to do that well in a way that engages. You take, for example, Formula E racing. So within Formula E racing, you have this thing called the fan boost. And depending on the crowd's interest and support for a driver, you have this capacity to improve the performance of the car as it's racing. And that's remarkable, isn't it? Because you think in the past, the spectators were here, the players were there, there's a bit of interaction, but not much. Here we have now, through digital technology, the capacity for the spectator to affect the performance of the car within the race. And that is a completely different proposition, I think, for the future of sport.
So then, Sean, what does the ideal future look like for a company that is digitizing traditional sports? Is this something that you'd like to see work alongside traditional sports or become its own new discipline?
Actually, what I'd like to say, I was thinking about, for example, we also have a baseball games. So in the case of Major League Baseball, the players' lifetime is very short, I think. So as a pitcher, after 40, they should retire. But in virtual reality baseball games, they can extend their lives as a player. So that's what I'm thinking about the future of VR esports. And also I'm dreaming, I'm also a hardcore gamer myself. So maybe this kind of, Roger Clemens, other pitchers, they can be more interested in gaming stuff. So after they retire again for VR baseball players, they can move on. Maybe a League of Legends player, it can be a good news. I think dreaming like that thing.
All right. To direct a question at you, Jason, in your role as part of the IeSF Athletes Commission, what are you sort of hearing from, or at least seeing about athletes, or e-athletes rather, looking towards different games? Is this something that you see people looking towards already, or is this still something that you see being a little bit more distant when it comes to player interests?
I'm not sure I entirely understood the question, but so what I think you're asking is like the way athletes move from one game to another.
Right.
So I think even now, when Overwatch came out not so long ago, like half the Counter-Strike base just moved across. And while I think that's really good because it allows new sports to come in and get developed, it's also slightly bad in a sense that a game can die overnight. So if you're really good at one game and a new game comes up and takes away a lot of the athletes because it's flashy, it's got more sponsors, it's got more money in it, you can kill a game that someone's worked many years to put in. And I think that's a fear for athletes because you can put in a lot of hard work and not succeed, and then you've got very little to fall back on if you can't adapt to the new game.
It's definitely a big concern. I know we talked about that a little bit earlier as well. So what's a way that the esports community as a whole can look towards, I guess, merging with the virtual traditional sports, the digitalized sports in the future? Is that something that you foresee being embraced by the esports community as an esports or as an esport, or do you think they'll still be pretty separate entities moving forward?
I think there'll still be separate entities moving forward because I don't think virtual reality is developed enough yet to integrate the two together. Currently, you see a lot of advertisements using virtual reality ideas. One of the ones I was talking with some of the people earlier was about the whole thing of Rocket League and then moving in it with real cars and putting virtual reality as if you're driving a real car around and mixing it with Rocket League. So right now, I think virtual reality still got a long way to go before it can become fully integrated into esports to make it almost one and the same. But at the same time, I'm excited to see where it goes forward and to see what the potential is.
I mean, I would add to that it's really, I think, important that we sort of step back and realize where we are. It was just a year ago that PlayStation released its VR accessory, and they've had a really successful year with it, I would say. And if you want to sort of analogize our present times, I would say that the esports industry, if you compare it to film, is still in the kind of era of the silent movie. It's such early days, and really everyone that's in this room is a pioneer, because I have conversations with people mostly where I say I'm doing something in esport, and they say, what's that? And I'm sure you all do as well. It's remarkable to see just how new this is for many people, including people within the world of sport. But even in this last 2 years, I've seen so much change there and so much awareness now of what's happening. It feels like there's been a shift in how sports are orientating themselves. And I think a big part of that is that we find ourselves in a time of quite radical media change, perhaps unlike anything since the 1980s with the IOC's renegotiation of contracts with broadcasters. I think we're entering a very different economic model for the monetization of sports-related content. And I think that's partly why traditional sport is looking at esport, because it's suggesting a completely different proposition where with something like Twitch, you follow the players, you don't, there's no broadcasters. It's something that is a very different relationship between the content generators and the audiences. So those sorts of things are, I think, where there's incredible excitement, and that is also at the level of creativity. One of the reasons why I think that VR is not just the same as 3D TV is because I've noticed over the last few years both industry getting involved with content creation, but production companies as well reorientating their work, and also people shooting stuff not just in standard format for flat screen experiences, but dual shooting for virtual reality experiences as well. And that's something that's a tangible reality within the industry.
Matthew, would you echo that sentiment with regards to the ITTF?
Yeah, for sure. We've dabbled a little bit with VR broadcasting, which a lot of sports have. I'm not convinced that actual VR broadcasting of a table tennis event is the way forward for us, because a table tennis table is quite small, so you can see the whole table just straight ahead. It's not like a football field where you have the benefit of moving around and seeing defenders and the strikers and what the manager's doing and what the goalkeeper's doing, etc., etc. You can see just on one camera. But where I see the benefit and the integration with everything with the VR e-gaming sphere into more traditional broadcasting of what the ITTF is doing, is merging it together. So you're watching the ITTF World Championships. We have viewership of about 200 million. Player A versus player B, great match, everyone's happy, but then you're talking to your mate, you text him on WhatsApp saying, do you see that final? Very cool. I bet I can beat you in table tennis, which is the common rivalry because everyone's played table tennis, and the common thing I hear every day is, I'm amazing at table tennis, I can definitely beat you. So if then you could turn that around and then you could play on the same table with VR headset that you were just watching your favorite table tennis players play on in the same stadium, the same table, the atmosphere, but you wipe out the players, and then all of a sudden you're playing your mate, and you're in Australia and you're playing your mate in Mexico with a VR headset on the exact same table that you were just watching the World Championships on. I think that can be very powerful and also great promotion for our ITTF events, and merging it in with more of the esports sphere and the hardcore gamers that we want to bring into our product as well.
Matt, can I ask you a question? Have you come across the augmented reality table tennis table?
No.
So there's a guy from Germany who a year or so back designed an AR table tennis table, and it essentially takes the regular table and has a projection above it that then maps the area of the table. And it's really worth having. I might show it tomorrow actually in the talk I'm giving, because we haven't talked about augmented reality much at all, and there's a whole amount of energy around that specifically, and many people I know feel that AR is really the future, or certainly mixed reality is the future of this whole game, and the AR table tennis table where you have to put your I always thought it was a bat, not a racket, isn't it? Oh, table tennis bat?
Officially called racket, mate.
Okay, racket. Corrected. You have to log into the table by putting your racket on the table. It's fascinating to see, but it tracks all the activity on it.
Yeah, now you explain it a bit more. We have spoken to these exact same guys. There was a viral video about a year ago, so they got in contact with us. So we are discussing ways that we can collaborate with them to create a cool game. It's good for training because then you have to be hitting the ball into a certain box, and they can track your accuracy and then also your movements and everything. So it also goes the next level, basically bringing VR, AR, e-gaming into on a table. So then we can bring this technology also into our broadcasting. So between the games and an actual table tennis match, lights go off, you see on the table where the ball's been moving, basically what you'd see Hawkeye on table tennis, but I mean in tennis, but you actually see it live on the table between the games. So that's something also very powerful in how these two worlds can merge.
I know at least myself as a esports broadcaster really look forward towards augmented reality or virtual reality, because when you have that sort of perfect information or the ability to really get deep down into the game, you become able to sort of tell much more advanced stories, given all of this ultimate level of understanding, data analysis, or even just being able to see things more closely to more accurately tell the story of what's actually happening. So virtualization is very exciting from a broadcasting standpoint, both for the broadcaster and the game being broadcasted. And of course for the viewers as well, it's an augmented experience. I know we've talked primarily about virtual reality as a way of digitalizing traditional sports, but are there any other trends moving forward that you see other than virtual reality? I know, Andy, you mentioned AR, which is something I guess we haven't really talked too much about.
Well, the one thing that sort of connects a little bit with the table tennis table is data visualization. And we live in a data-driven economy in all sorts of aspects, including sport specifically. But I think if you consider the ways in which data visualization becomes entertainment content, then there's again another way of engaging people. I'll give you one example. A couple of years ago, the Tokyo 2020 committee released a promo video about its fencing coverage in their games. And the video shows fencers competing, but the data that's being visualized through graphics, through CGI effectively, is about trying to convey what's happening to the athlete as they're performing. So using sort of biometric monitoring to show their heart rate, to show their core body temperature, to show their hit rates and positioning, all that sort of data is becoming part of the expectation of audiences to engage with. And so again, we have this sort of amplification of just the kind of physical world through the coverage of it through data. And I think that's another trend we can see emerging too.
And it's not just on broadcast, we're also seeing it inside stadiums. Now TV broadcast for traditional sports is getting so smart, so detailed, so data-driven, as you say, because that's what people want to see, especially when someone's watching an e-game or you're playing an e-game. It's all about data, numbers here, numbers there. I'm not a gamer, unfortunately, so I don't know all the details, but whenever I see these games on YouTube or Twitch, it's just numbers and data. So that's something traditional sports we're learning from, and from the broadcast. And not just from the broadcast, it's being brought inside to the stadiums. Because now people are getting very comfortable in their seats, in their recliner, buying cheap beer and cheap pizza to watch the football, and then maybe they don't bother going to the stadium to sit in the minus 10 degrees and buy overpriced beer and get a crappy seat and view the stadium. So now we're seeing more and more people and event hosts bringing this data and this experience inside the stadium. So you can get your mobile phone out, you can put it over the pitch, and you can see the players running around and how many passes they've done, their percentage of completion rates and all these type of things, the experience that you get on television and the experience that you get actually playing FIFA on your PlayStation or your Xbox or your PC, and you're getting that inside the stadium. So that increases my enjoyment, increases the appeal of paying the extra money to go trek across town and go to the stadium, because then I can get the same cool data experience that I would be getting in my lounge room.
I mean, this is an economic necessity also, because we've known for many years that people have second screen experiences wherever they are. So even if you've paid whatever it is to get into the stadium to watch the match, you'll spend a good chunk of your time looking at your mobile phone, even though you're right there. And so as a kind of event host or property owner, you want to ensure that when your spectator, when your ticket holder is looking at something on their phone, they're looking at your stuff rather than some other third party's content. And so there's that learning that's translating from kind of in living room second screen experiences into the live experience as well, I think.
So when we talk about virtualization of traditional sports, we had a panel discussion earlier about the relationship of esports to the Olympics and how to kind of bridge that gap. Do you think that there is a reality in the future where that becomes more accessible? Maybe esports doesn't, progress forward as quickly as you would imagine in acceptance at the Olympics. Do you think they would be maybe more willing to embrace the digitalization or the VR version of a traditional sport? Is that something that can be kind of a gateway?
Potentially, yeah. I would hope. LA 24, we've got a cool table tennis game as a discipline and a gold medal in the Olympics. Why not? We can have the guys playing your traditional table tennis, but then we've got our world championships and other world champions and Olympic champions playing VR table tennis. The sky's the limit. So I think that's definitely a possibility and a decent avenue for esports to get into the Olympics, especially when we're talking about FIFA soccer. The stats of people playing this is mind-blowing. Watched the FIFA Interactive World Cup in my home in Singapore the other day. I was blown away by the level of broadcast and the interest in this. So I could definitely see something like that becoming just an extra discipline of the current Olympic sports on the Olympic program.
I guess my one concern I would have with integrating VR with more traditional sports is I don't think it would change much in the aspect that it would just take viewers from the traditional sports. It wouldn't really add viewers to the scene, whereas doing VR for sports that are non-traditional or not in the Olympics I think would be more beneficial, and there's more likely for that to work, in my opinion.
What would be an example of that?
So I think if the Olympics were very set on having a physical aspect to an esports, and so they wouldn't allow a game such as Counter-Strike to be played because of the non-physical aspect, then maybe if everyone was running around on a treadmill, they might be more inclined to say, well, this fits the definition of a sport, and then it would be into the Olympics more likely, maybe.
But I think there's also quite a lot of, there's two aspects of it. One is about the VR becoming a discipline in sport, in traditional sports. But even if you think about I think about these things as incremental. So the first step for VR integration could include something like additional price points within televisual packages. So you might pay your premium package for some content, and then you might pay a bit extra for a VR experience within that. So, and it might be in football, let's say you're watching the premium content on your television, and then in replays you can choose the VR option to see that replay and experience it in a more 360 manner. And that, for me, what's interesting about that is it's not the end point. These are stepping stones that nurture changes in behavior and habits in a way that the PlayStation VR accessory does. We've now got a generation of gamers that are expecting to play within VR. And fast forward 10 years from now, and you've got a whole body of people that see that as the core way of experiencing gaming generally. And so whilst it's tempting at this stage in our history to think that esport is fixed, in actual fact, it's incredibly dynamic, and its history is still quite recent. So even thinking about how esports innovates around the technology is a big part of this equation, I think, too.
A lot of the revenue for esports, or at least from the professional teams, and the same thing for traditional sports athletes in competitions like the Olympics, comes from advertising and the ability to succeed professionally in esports or traditional sports, and then get those big contracts from advertisers. Is there any way that adding a virtual reality component to either traditional sports or esports enhances that opportunity as well?
Is there advertising in your VR games? There are many slots for advertising, but the thing is that anyways, in virtual reality, there's no click, so which means it is not easy to track who is clicking that ads. So maybe just running video ads. Maybe in other ways, we can make it differentiate which sports gears. Maybe, for example, table tennis. There's an A brand table tennis racket, and there's a B brand table tennis racket. We can make a slight difference in between, so that we can charge these branded rackets as an item. Once they buy, the real table tennis racket will be delivered to home. In that ways, people can enjoy table tennis at their home on virtual reality, and with the real table tennis racket, they can go to the real table tennis place to play. Maybe that can be one way. Anyways, there should be a lot more things to be explored.
And just from a traditional sports standpoint, when I'm walking into Red Bull or Coca-Cola or whatever sponsor to try and pitch to sponsor a table tennis event, and I say, okay, you've got an A board, you've got a floor sticker, you've got some social media interaction, you've got XYZ, some Eurosport sports, and then you can also go on top of that. So, okay, we've got this table tennis VR game that if you come on board as a potential partner at our World Championships, you also get activation through our VR game, which has X amount of people playing that globally. So that would be a completely different market from the hardcore table tennis fans watching table tennis content. So then it's a side sell and an additional perk, let's say, for a sponsor to come on and have the same advertising that they would have at a table tennis event, but in the VR game, which is being played by a completely different demographic than would be watching a table tennis event.
I guess within the boxing game or whatever sport, you could make it part of the game experience that you engage with products even. I guess, you in between rounds, you might have a drink, maybe not of Coke. I guess Coke you don't drink in between boxing rounds, but you could have a part of the re-energizing your athletes.
Maybe after drinking Red Bull, the energy refilled again.
But that gets past the click problem, because then you have to look and select things to replenish your energy. So you can have products located within it, certainly.
Yeah, there might be one possibility. And the other thing, actually, as I already spoken on a slide on my presentation, the average viewers of a Major League Baseball is extremely old. So maybe our mission can make baseball cool again. So cooperating with the Major League Baseball Association and make a kind of a television reality show, something like the American Idols. So make a home run derbies and let them match with real baseball players. So anyways, whatever it is, make this baseball cool again, which can attract a lot of advertising money, like sponsorships. There'll be one way, I think.
I mean, they've done that a bit with, I don't know whether you have it in other countries, I imagine you do, but in the UK, we had a program called The Jump, which was effectively celebrities trying to do ski jumping and not doing a really great job, actually. But you know, I would imagine the audiences that have seen ski jumping now in the UK are far in excess of those that would watch it at an Olympic Winter Games. So yeah, those are interesting crossovers within the industry.
Yeah, I'm interested in. I'd like to work with you.
Some really cool opportunities, and as we draw near the end of this panel discussion, just a reminder to our audience to maybe be thinking of some questions for our question and answer portion coming up. Just to finalize things as we draw to a close, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share about kind of the future of traditional sports and esports when it comes to future technologies like VR, AR, or anything else that you have yet to mention?
I mean, one thing that I would like to mention is that there's still, I think, a lot to be done to bring these two together. I experienced the Les Mills Immersive Studio last month and had my spinning experience within this sort of immersive cave, which was phenomenal, really. And the people that were doing it were really excited by it. And here we have a kind of integration of a digital creative narrative with the physical experience of a spinning class. And it just speaks to me of how the range of ways in which physical activity can be gamified, can become part of that bridging between sport and e-sport, are still very expansive. And so to kind of work on all parameters of this relationship, I think is crucial, rather than just to focus on the currently established titles that are out there.
As your virtual reality sports game developers, we are just focusing on creating a good quality product. But the reality is that virtual VR devices, it is not easy to wear and not comfortable. So we should rely on a lot to the manufacturers. So a good thing is that from next year, there are a lot of smaller, lighter version of VR devices coming out to the market. So we are very positive about this VR industry. So what I'd like to stress out, I'll just keep eye on this VR sports, which can be maybe in in 2 years or 3 years, can be a future for esports or a future for sports.
Lots of cool opportunities coming in the future. So I guess that is going to conclude our panel discussion. So let's go ahead and transition into a little bit of Q&A. So if anyone in the audience has any questions for our panelists or just comments about the topic being discussed here, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone as quickly as possible. So just going ahead and looking for hands in the audience. Go for it.
I have a question. You were talking about the e-formula where people could, I guess, nominate a car that they liked. And I'm just wondering, in terms of, you haven't really touched on match fixing or gambling, but obviously something like that would be a killer for anyone who wanted to bet on the other teams. You could have someone like a Chinese billionaire who could basically buy up 100,000 votes inside China. So what are you doing in terms of, the gambling aspect of all of these sports? Because I know the table tennis one, you can also have algorithms within the game seeing whether people are cheating or not. But are you thinking, is that on your radar at this point or not?
I mean, I think it is on the radar. I mean, I remember there was a conference in Geneva last year that I chaired part of, and it was focused on corruption and betting especially. And of course, it's a minefield with esports, and I think there's a lot to be figured out. And people are very aware that one of the concerns about anything digital is its vulnerability to that sort of thing. So it's a really crucial point, and that's why it does feel like there's so much work to be done here, so that it doesn't jeopardize that kind of fundamental opportunity. But yeah, it's a really good point. I don't think anyone's solved that really, but I think it's crucial.
All right, over here.
I've got a comment that I'll sort of transition into a question for Mr. Sean. So basically, one of the big things that most people don't realize in esports is the distribution of skills. Because usually you could only play against someone from your own club, your own country, you're in the same room. You could play table tennis against who's ever next to you. But with VR, it enables you to go online, match against some random people, someone from Russia, Serbia, Switzerland, Finland. So you got that immediate diversification of skills, which is very good. But now the scenario that I would like to paint here is actually to ask my question. So, for instance, let's say we had Matthew now, who's a veteran in table tennis. We set up a table here and we set up a VR setting there. Obviously, if you play VR table tennis and you actually play the real thing, the skills aren't transferable yet. You could have 10,000 hours on a real table tennis, and if you go to the VR or the augmented reality, it's not going to be the same, not yet, in my opinion at least. So the question that I want to pose to Mr. Sean here is that gap between the real thing and the VR experience. How quickly are you closing that gap? How quickly is the technology progressing to give you the real experience for, let's say, if I'm playing against the guy from Russia, in, let's say, Russia versus Serbia in the VR tennis compared to the real thing? How quickly are you closing that gap?
Yeah, you're right. That is a good point. In terms of that, there should be well-developed communications and skills to be translated exactly to the game itself. So actually, we are learning it from building boxing. We are observing skills from Manny Pacquiao. So we'd like to exactly display his skills on our virtual reality. So I cannot tell you when we can make it perfectly by when, but we are really working on very hard. And actually, in terms of the table tennis, we already tested with Korean amateur players. They said that it is very close to the reality. So maybe if you have time, maybe come visit to my office. You can experience it. Yes. Anyways, what I can tell you is that there can be no guaranteed time, but we are working very hard. So all of our teams, they worked during the last weekend for preparing Manny Pacquiao boxing. They can. That is the thing that I can say.
Can I just offer something as well? It's a really fascinating question for me because I think it sort of begs the question as to whether it needs to replicate reality at all. And I think of Taekwondo and how there are at least two different versions of Taekwondo, and nobody would ask, is one trying to get closer to the other? And in fact, it might be that the virtual reality version of table tennis is a completely different version, but is capable of being brought into your brand and identity, even if the skills that require you to be good at it are different. So, yeah, I have to throw that in there.
Yeah, I agree. I would not see VR table tennis as a game, as a pathway to playing professional live on the table tennis. I think it can be complementary. Of course, in the future, if you can get it very close to the actual skills and the actual movements of what you would need to be a successful table tennis player on the table, then that's great. But if not, and it goes a different direction, then also okay for us.
But there have been some examples. I mean, there's the Nissan Gamer to Racer program where there have been, gamers that have been great at racing that have then entered cars and started to race as well. So, I mean, it's a really great question about simulation, and if we can imagine a perfect simulation, then of course it translates perfectly. But you're right, we're not there yet, I think. But
yeah, see, because the main thing is if you don't replicate it to a very accurate degree, I think the problem is then the traditional sportsmen are going to, stick to what they're doing and not, see VR as a next step. So that's why I think to get it as an accurate simulation is a very important part of it. Because as Matthew just said, it must be complementary to your sport. It needs to enable you to get new skills, experience new things. But if they can't reach that yet, then I see a foreseeable problem in the future there.
And it just comes down to who's Sean's target market? Is it table tennis players, or is it the people who've never played table tennis professionally or even at a club that just want to be having a fun hit with a mate that he can't be with right then and just want to enjoy themselves and even chatting on the headset while they're playing?
Maybe similar point. Even if we are trying a lot to make it the exact replica for the real table tennis, if I speak the table tennis, but somehow I'm thinking it doesn't need to be exactly copied because the real table tennis itself, it is real table tennis. When real table tennis, it is slightly different. With this real table tennis, it can go as it is. But anyways, it is still exercise. So maybe it can deliver table tennis fans or non-table tennis fans to enjoy both the real table tennis and the virtual table tennis in two ways. Maybe it can be better.
But this has always been a question of televisual content of sport generally. I remember with London 2012, all the conversations before it that the legacy of this Olympic Games would be more participation in physical activity, and just didn't happen. And so even to expect that a VR table tennis game would translate even into more interest to watch table tennis is not something we can take for granted, and probably need to think carefully about whether that's part of the strategy or not. It might be you extend your audience into completely different demographics, but engage them with quite different content to your core content.
Thank you very much. I think we have one more question over here.
Well, just to jump into your question, if you watch Formula One now and then, they have limited track time. They only drive Formula One for once in the 2 weeks during the year. I think it's 24 races or 22 races. Now, Formula One is actually, the drivers train on simulating machines that can also add VR. And they are so realistic that what they train before a GP weekend, they train on those simulating machines, and then they go on the track, and it's completely synced. So those machines are so realistic, as well as VR, into that simulating machine, that professional racing athletes, Formula One drivers, actually train on those machines. Now, table tennis, obviously, apparently, is not that far yet, but it does exist. Like, Formula One has it. So I think the gap, depending on the game, is already bridged.
One question in the back.
Thank you. Yep, working. I just want to drag it back a little bit to the sports synergies talking about, rather than, with all due respect to Sean, virtual reality. But we've seen in the US a number of national basketball teams buying esports teams. I think Sean made comment about, with the Overwatch League, the number of sports teams bought into that. What does the panel see the value in the traditional sports organisations buying esports teams, and maybe vice versa?
I think teams such as Arsenal and what Sean mentioned, buying esports teams, it's a simple fact of them wanting to touch a different demographic. So you can see traditional sports, baseball, football, the fans generally a little bit older. So then that suits a certain commercial market for that particular sporting team. So now if they want to be touching the younger generation, the 16 to 30-year-olds, they can either rebrand let's use a football example, they can rebrand what Arsenal is and try to make that more attractive for the youth, or why try to reinvent the wheel when they can just buy into a product that's already very much in this space and already very successful for the target market that they're selling to. Then they can put this into their commercial and sponsorship packages and then be selling to quite a broader audience than what they already have.
I mean, just a small thing to add to that is about the manner in which, by accessing that younger demographic, you're able to nudge them in the direction of your content rather than be completely separate from it. So I think that's probably a big anxiety, that without that relationship to that younger demographic through esports, there's not the potential to influence behaviors and interests that having them under the hood would be.
I was probably more meant where Vlad earlier on made comment about the Olympics want to get into esports, but does esports want to get into the Olympics? Is what are these teams going to bring to esports? Not about esports actually reaching a target demographic for them.
I think in a sense, currently with esports still being under its development phase, these bigger brands bring a lot of money into esports, which, although it's not necessarily the only way to promote esports and get it more recognized, it does help. So by buying an Overwatch team, for example, there's at least 6 players in an Overwatch team, and each one of those, when they get bought, have some sort of financial backing to be able to take the game more seriously. And when they take the game more seriously, it becomes bigger, and as it becomes bigger, it helps the entire esports community. And currently, I think that is really what more traditional sports buying into esports is doing for esports. And then at the same sense, when a proper football club or a baseball club buys into esports, it's also announcing to the world that they take esports seriously and that esports is in fact a real sport. And so while they keep buying into the esports clubs, it's promoting esports as an official game title as far as those clubs that are buying them are concerned.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Let's go ahead and head over somewhere.
This feels like an e-sport right here. Here we go. Come on. Get there.
If we
get
could
there, get there.
virtualize this process, it'd make it a whole lot easier.
Thanks for the very interesting discussion today. I see the esports like the League of Legends playing a pretty nice and big role as a live event in the actual venue. But the VR of the traditional sports, I wonder how the VR of the traditional sports play a role as a live sports in the actual venue. So I kind of, hard time to imagine, those kind of VR of the traditional sports kind of working as a live event in the venue.
I mean, one example is that you can locate yourself anywhere within the field of play in real time. So if you think about, I don't know, a football match or any kind of team event, when the content is filmed with LiDAR scanning, which is taking depth readings of the match in real time and translating that into a computer-generated model based on pre-designed models of players and the stadium, you as the spectator can then be within the field of play as it's happening rather than just sit on the sidelines and watch it from a distance. And I would say that's a much more compelling, immersive experience. And I think a lot of people would like to do that.
Maybe in other ways that in virtual reality, in our company, we tried it several times. At the live event, I think there'll be a big screen, a 4-sided screen. So actually, we can make a kind of mixed reality video. So player itself can be displayed in the game itself, so it can be more dynamic and provide immersive experience to spectators itself. So it can be, I think, to me, it'll be more interesting to just watching racing games, because you can see your players in the game itself. So at a live event, it can be a perfect form of enjoying.
All right, thank you very much for your wonderful questions. And of course, to our panel hosts, that's going to do it for our Q&A. So let's hear a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.